Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I am your host, Olga Peters, and this is the show where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. This week, we are talking about the Vermont tourism economy, and listeners to this show will know it's one of our favorites. We love digging into this one and all its stories. So joining me this week, of course, is regular contributor, Representative Emily Kornheiser, fresh from a recently finished biennium. You're looking much more awake than I have seen you.
Thanks, Olga. I don't know if I'd call myself fresh, but it is certainly recent off a new finished biennium. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. And also want to welcome to the show Ann Wallace Allen. She is a reporter for 7Days out of Burlington. That's where 7Days is. That's not where you are. But we are so glad you can be joining us today, Ann.
Thank you, Olga. It's so good to be here.
So just for some of our listeners' edification, before we dive into the conversation, I went to the Agency of Commerce and Community Development's website and looked at some of the tourism and marketing numbers and data that they keep. And some of this I knew, some of it was new to me. Tourism is a $3 billion industry in Vermont, according to the ACCD, supports about 30,000 jobs or 10% of the Vermont workforce, one of the biggest industries in the state. And we welcome approximately or more than 13 million visitors every year. This was interesting to me because we're down in the ski area, Ann, Emily and I. And so I didn't realize summer is the busiest season as far as visitors go. And most of our visitors are from Massachusetts, and then kind of counting down New York, Connecticut. And this was very funny to me. New Jersey and New Hampshire was both 7% of visitors. And I just found it very funny that New Jersey and New Hampshire would have the same amount of visitors. I don't know, that amused me. So there's just kind of a very quick rundown on the very top level numbers for the industry. I would love to start with you, Emily, and just say, as a lawmaker, when you're sitting in the State House and conversations come up around tourism, because it seems to hit almost every sector. There's ag tourism, there's maple syrup, there's ski areas, there's outdoor recreation, there's the attracting remote workers, which is another fun one. What does the story sound like in the State House?
Well, before I even answer that, I just want to say that with all due respect to the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, I think there's a range of ways you can interpret the data that they share and that they interpreted.
You think?
And their numbers might be a little bit larger than some other economic analysts might come up with.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because the reason I went to the state is the state puts a lot of effort into telling the tourism story and the visitor story. And so I think it's really great that we have that right off the bat. We're like, okay, here's a new discrepancy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think, and we can talk about sort of what, one of the ways we sort of talk about impacts on economy is sort of like what the magnifying effect or what the ripple effect of something is. And I think how far out you count the tourism economy and what that means for the jobs or the not jobs that come from it, or the
good point,
economic impacts that come from it are interesting. We also have between the first and the second highest rate of second homes or non-primary homes in the country. And that's, a large piece of Vermont's history. And those folks are counted as tourists too. And some of them come here for, the entire summer and live in Marlborough, right. And their grandparents and their great-grandparents have all come and lived in Marlborough and gone to the music festival and done whatever else they do. And then there's sort of, the folks who have a condo or a condo equivalent at Mount Snow and come here, a few times a year, or Airbnb their properties and come here once a year. So But to actually answer your question, what it makes me think of is right out of college, I started a career in international development. And that was like pretty immediately post-Soviet, building post-Soviet economies. And sort of bringing, newer, better capitalism all over the world. Fascinating way to start one's career. And a big part of what I was involved in quite a few times was smaller countries of fairly remarkably well-educated folks having really intense global economic pressure to sort of save their economy or spark their economy through tourism. And there's been sort of various iterations of that globally over the last 40 years, 50 years. And, we talk about ecotourism, and now we're talking about agritourism. And, I think Italy does some agritourism to sort of, spark their more rural areas. Certainly we do. And there's historical tourism, there's all those things, but it was this idea that essentially their post-Soviet economies of fairly educated folks would be saved by tourism, by telling the story of their countries and having folks from all over the world flock in, visit for a week or two, dump money into the economy and bail. And it was really interesting to meet these folks who often had graduate degrees, who had been sort of, working in government most of their lives, or as teachers or whatever it was, and sort of shifting their whole frame of being to be promoting themselves, basically, be promoting this country that they live in and their story about who they were and what they were in a way that would be appealing to a stranger. And then also just sort of like learning the particular tricks of the trade that allow a person to work in, say, food service or hospitality, right? Like that really like deep subversion of self and needs, right? It's not, in a normal workplace, there's some degree of negotiation. In an immediate customer service experience, there generally isn't. It's generally sort of the customer's always right? And so that was this very interesting, and then, I left that work, but as it's evolved, there's sort of been more and more and more research that this is not a way to save a developing economy. And economies need to be sort of developing from their like nascent skill set and their nascent human capital and social capital, and even sort of, physical and natural capital. And then coming to Vermont 20 years later, being in Vermont off and on through that time, but like working in the Vermont economy to develop the Vermont economy as a legislator 20 years later, and seeing that we're still telling that story here, that somehow we're going to be saved by these, folks down the road coming in to throw their money into our pot. And what does that actually mean? And what does that look like? And what does that mean for Vermonters? And so that's sort of the conversation I go into the State House with. I have lots of thoughts about what happens in the State House, but we can get to that later.
How about for you, Anne? What's the story you hear around tourism and business? And is it a savior story like Emily was just sharing?
I agree that with both of you that the statistics can be viewed in a lot of different ways. And one of the things that they count is actually family visits. That's probably why there's so many visitors from New Hampshire. I'm sure there's other reasons too, but often you hear that 40 or 30 to 50% of all tourism is people visiting their families, and then while they're in that other new place, going to an event or something. So there definitely is an effort to, with most economic impact studies that are sponsored by somebody who's trying to promote their own industry, an effort to say that, tourism is, as Emily put it, a savior. And I have also lived in the developing world and have seen that. And another thing that happens is that people sort of take one aspect of their culture and they have to spin that into a story that is told over and over and over again until it almost becomes who they really are, instead of what was just a small part of who they really are. I think another way that one of the reasons that tourism has been viewed as a savior and as so many people have promoted over the years is because, as we know, our population and our industry has moved to urban centers, and it's left the rural areas saying, how are we going to sustain ourselves, especially as farms merge and agriculture no longer supports people, and tourism is the logical, time-honored, centuries-old way of taking rural areas and injecting some capital into them with the same consequences that there've always been. It's there's a supporting cast for the people from the wealthier areas who come and rent houses and eat in restaurants and go to cultural events. What was your other question?
When you're out reporting on Vermont and its economy and its jobs, what are the stories you're seeing? Like, growing up in Windham County with the Deerfield Valley is where I grew up, like tourism was a sacred cow. You don't bash tourism, because what if the visitors decide never to come back? So that's the story I kind of grew up with. So I was just curious about what else you're seeing, and how it's shaping what you cover.
I think for a lot of people, owning your own business, for many, many people, owning your own business is a dream, and they're willing to sacrifice a lot to do that. And a great way to do that is to own a restaurant or a cafe or a B&B. It's super risky in some ways. I mean, they go in and out of business and it's a ton of work, but I think for many people it's worth it. So I often meet people who are running small tourism businesses who are working 70 hours a week, and a whole family's in there working, but they're really happy and that's what they want to be doing. And it's their business. And so, tourism supports that kind of story. And with its cyclical nature, these are people who have no summer of their own because they're working, but then they can take a few months off and they can, spend the winter in Costa Rica or whatever. There's a lot of stories like that. Of course, the pandemic has absolutely changed everything, and we can get to that later, but that has been one of the tourism models that I've seen. And I lived in Mexico for 9 months too, and it's kind of striking how similar that whole model was there. And then, of course, there's the other side of it. The ski areas are a good example of this. They have a lot of sort of food service type jobs, lift operator jobs that don't pay very well. And again, that fits into some people's lives really well, because they can work in the winter at ski areas and then they can work at the summer at whatever else. But it also means that there's a large population of people who aren't making very much money, who usually can't afford to live in the resort towns. And that raises not only a whole host of new problems, but also kind of we see this in ski areas all over the country, where you end up with a town that has only second homeowners or business owners, and all of the people who work in the businesses are living an hour away or are living in a house with 16 people in it. And that's something that I know Emily and her colleagues are trying to figure out in terms of like making affordable housing more available. But it's a consequence of tourism for sure.
And it doesn't just, in those communities where folks are living in, or the folks who work in a community don't live in a community. It's not just that the community that they're working in is basically, empty of people who are investing in it on a day-to-day basis, in terms of volunteerism and government and all those things. It's also the community that people are leaving to go to work doesn't have folks who spend enough hours in it to get it done. I think, pre-pandemic, working downtown in Brattleboro, there's such an incredibly vibrant interaction between folks who are living and working there and like volunteering there and going out for like, it's just a fully living, vibrant town where people both live and work. It's a very different thing. And I think one of the stories that we tell about Vermont and its volunteerism and its devotion to community and what makes it work and all of those things, and essentially even part of what we sell to tourists, is something that's only possible if people have time to really be anchored in their homes.
Sure.
Interesting.
There's towns like Woodstock, which is half an hour away from Killington, but also is just a tourist destination in its own right, that have been really, really, really smart about trying to address that, because they have a lot of their houses, like their village is dark at night because people from California own a house in the village, and they're only there 2 weeks a year, and the rest of the time it's It's just either retired business executives or nobody walking around. And so they have a local option tax, 1%, and they use that for an economic development fund that they have taken to improve their downtown to attract tourists, yes, but also to come up with ways to help provide housing options for regular people whose kids go to the school, or firefighters, teachers, things like that. But Woodstock is a town that has the means to do that. A lot of the small towns that are being emptied out don't, for various reasons. Woodstock has a lot of very wealthy people. Somebody gave them $500,000 just to start a fund to help people with their down payments on their homes, working people. Other towns, so some towns are finding workarounds, but none of them are like truly sustainable in regular towns.
Mm-hmm. I think what my concern with tourism is, on an economic level, is we have towns that, this is just my term, their economy is basically a mono economy. That just like way back when you had the one mill or the one car plant and the factory store, it's kind of that, and that lack of economic diversity just, to me, feels very fragile and very unsustainable. I don't know if that's anything you see in either of your realms, Anne and Emily.
Well, I mean, the pandemic showed that for the whole world to see. And I think we did a lot to provide immediate support to everyone who was impacted by that. That immediate support took many different forms, and certainly the immediate support that business owners received, I think, was handed out a little bit more freely than unemployment insurance. And unemployment insurance can be quite complicated if you work in food service and have the unsteady hours and unsteady income that might come from that. I think 2 years ago, I don't even remember when the pandemic started anymore, but in those early years, when we saw essentially that fragility writ large, I thought very hopefully that those lessons learned about what it means to be entirely dependent on this one path to stability would mean something, and that we might then have a chance to sort of build our way out of it. But when people are in crisis, they don't want to build their way to a new future for the most part. They actually just want everything to go back to the way it was. Mm-hmm. And so I haven't seen the kind of transitions that I was thinking would happen on sort of the recovery path.
I think that some people did see when they left their service job or their tourism job that they had not really been enjoying it, and they realized that being away from it was an opportunity to try something new. I know that I talked to Etsy a couple months ago, and like their website just boomed enormously in 2020 because a lot of people started doing their hobbies, making money at it. So I think that's why it is the hospitality sector that is saying the most that they're being limited by lack of employees. I mean, they're actually closing their businesses early, and they're limiting their hours because they can't find people. And not coincidentally, those are the jobs where they have to deal with the public, not always a courteous public, and where the pay has traditionally been low, and also where hours have been very unpredictable, which makes it extremely difficult to arrange childcare. So I think that some people did take the crisis as an opportunity to find some other way to make a living. And I mean, that might lead to a permanent change. Another thing that has happened is that these hospitality businesses have had to raise their pay pretty significantly. And, for the people who want a flexible job or a part-time job or a seasonal job and are now being paid more of a commensurate reward for doing that work, that could be a positive outcome of this, as long as that continues.
Thank you. So, Anne, I'm curious, I'm curious, how do you feel the tourist industry or economy, however you want to say it, shapes policy, either at the local level or the state level?
Oh boy, where do we begin? Well, it's all tied together, but we live in a state filled with beautiful, unsullied green fields and farms, and those are the things that have been beloved by visitors since the 19th century. And I think that some of the state environmental policies and also tax policies reward leaving land open, which I enjoy a lot. I think that tourism plays a role in Vermont's planning process. Vermont, the state of Vermont, has emphasized density in town centers and has tried to discourage sprawl, which is better for the environment when it works out the way that it can. And I know that our state's sort of curb appeal to visitors is in the back of people's minds when they're looking at how they want to structure and encourage development or discourage certain types of development. It's inseparable from our efforts to clean up Lake Champlain. I think people who live in Vermont and love the lake want to clean the lake up because it shouldn't be polluted. But I also think that Lake Champlain is kind of a jewel of that region and is a huge draw for all kinds of visitors from Canada too. I mean, so much of our policy is tied to our image of ourselves as an agricultural state, as a rural state with traditional New Englandish town centers, and you see that in so much of our policy making.
Mm-hmm. Emily, did you want to say something?
Yeah, and it's interesting. There are different sort of flavors of the tourism that policy can promote or push. So I really appreciate, Anne, how you highlighted the parallel. It's so interesting that I don't have to think like a million thoughts a minute anymore, and like how much my brain has slowed down in the last week. So I'm trying to like even just grapple with what it means to have a slower brain right now. So excuse me. How it sort of a lot of the environmental work that we do and what environmental priorities went out are about sort of, we talk about a working landscape, but a working landscape and working lands and a working landscape can mean very, very different things. Mm-hmm. And the particular one that we choose to highlight and to invest in policy-wise is definitely the one that lines up with sort of the bucolic trademark Vermont vision. Even the fact that we are, the emphasis on saving the dairy industry rather than transitioning the dairy industry is a lot about, we have teams of researchers at UVM that actually, research how much our dairy industry sort of makes Vermont as tourism rather than as dairy. And then there's the sort of the spirit from the ski hills. And when we were doing redistricting, I became very fascinated with just this idea that, so Stratton and Snow became one district in our last redistricting. That's the district that Laura Sibilia sits in now. And what it would mean to have sort of one less ski mountain representative in the mix.
Yeah.
And then Heidi Sherman, who represents Mount Snow, sorry, not Mount Snow, excuse me, Stowe, they rhyme, who represents Stowe and has been, I'll even call her a vicious representative for Stowe, for good and for bad for that community, is stepping down and not running again. Mm-hmm. And so it's really going to be, it's very interesting to think about how the legacy and sort of the internal lobbying on behalf of the ski industry, which is a very, in some ways, very different industry than the more sort of scattered tourism that we might see in the Kingdom or in the sort of the towns, the non-ski towns surrounding Brattleboro. And how that lines up with this really intense consolidation of the ski industry that, like, at this point, we can't even pretend that those dollars are going to Vermonters anymore for the most part. I mean, and like that Vermonters can even afford to access those mountains. I mean, it's like, it's a full farce at this point. Those maps are completely consolidated. The money is going out of state. The prices are going up. The parking prices are going up. Like, there are very few Vermonters that can afford to ski regularly anymore.
It's true.
And so what that sort of pressure is, and it's not just, those representatives, there's entire, there's chambers of commerce that surround it. There's downtown business associations that surround it. There's a really significant network of lobbying energy that goes into continuing to tell that Vermont trademark story, both in terms of sort of what Vermont should look like, which lakes we should clean, the pollutants, the water pollutants on the east side of the state are totally different than the ones on the west side of the state, and we only care about the ones on the west side of the state. And then there's, it's this really interesting mix that sort of carries us forward. When we, even dared to talk about minimum wage laws that would encompass food service organizations and who sort of shows up for that. The policies that the chambers show up for and don't show up for is this really interesting mix that regularly surprises me at how little emphasis it often contains about sort of manufacturing or other companies. Like, it's really tourism interests for the most part by all of our chambers, including the bigger chambers. And that's that's also really interesting to me. And that can also mean that they care about housing, and all of a sudden the Vermont Chamber of Commerce wants to they're my only ally in shutting down the short-term rentals. And so it's just it's a wild ride that we're all on that gets mixed up together into the State House.
It's true what you say about the ski areas. It's really striking how they have sort of drawn apart, the corporately owned ones have drawn apart from the regular Vermont tourism, because a lot of, Vermont is lucky in that we have fall foliage all over the state. And so to some extent, our tourism is widely distributed all around the state.
It really is.
You have people who are regular people driving here to check out the leaves. You have people renting camps, and there's still, affordable ways to come and visit Vermont and see the leaves and things like that. But it's true, the ski areas have kind of, they became corporately owned very quickly. We still have some local ones like Bolton, and they don't even bother to return journalist calls. They're in other places. They're in British Columbia, they're in Colorado, and they are big businesses that are thinking of, who are sort of bringing a very different way of doing business to the state. I don't know if you guys heard, but Stowe is also doing high occupancy vehicles lanes for, it's not lanes, but this is what we had in DC. Like, if you had 3 or more people in your car that you got to park for free, and they're doing something like that too, as they try to struggle with the overcrowding on the mountain road in Stowe. So it is kind of a very diverse industry. It's up in the Northeast Kingdom, it's a pretty modest industry. They do have a big ski area there, Jay Peak. It's a lot of Canadians go there to ski, but it's very different from the southern Vermont ski areas that draw New Yorkers and people from Massachusetts and New Jersey. There's a lot of camps. A lot of people go to Vermont to hunt and fish. It's just a kind of, it's not quite the same thing that you're seeing in Burlington or at the ski areas, with a lot of food service jobs and a lot of kind of institutionalized service jobs, hospitality jobs. There's small inns and things like that. I think we should also talk about how short-term rentals fit in here, because
I definitely think we should. We actually, though, have to go to break so we can hear from some of our underwriters. But yeah, when we come back, let's dig into that short-term rentals, because that's a fascinating little can of worms all on its own. So stay tuned, listeners. The Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro. We'll return in a moment. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. If you are just joining us, I am your host, Olga Peters, and I am speaking with Ann Wallace Allen from 7Days, as well as regular contributor, Representative Emily Kornheiser. We are talking about the Vermont tourism industry. And Emily, before we dive back into the tourism, what do we need to remind our listeners of?
Well, Olga, the views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the host and the guests, and not the radio station, nor the TV station, nor any of our employers, friends, loved ones, or acquaintances.
Thank you very much. So Anne, during the break, you were, and I appreciate this because, you know, so much of my life has been in Southern Vermont that I realize I can have kind of blinders on. And you were talking about how different tourism can be in different areas of the state. And I'd love if you would just share some of that perspective with us.
So I live in northeastern Vermont, halfway between Montpelier and St. Johnsbury, and I spend a lot of time in the Northeast Kingdom. And when I go to Southern Vermont, I am struck by a lot of differences. Your tourism seems a little bit more focused on ski area type visitors, or there seems like there's a higher concentration of visitors from the urban areas who drive vehicles that stand out in Vermont. For example, they're not covered in dirt and mud like most Vermont ones are, or they dress differently, and the shops reflect that. Of course, Manchester is an extreme example of that, but that is something that I see more of in Southern Vermont. We have pockets of that in Northern Vermont, but I think that our tourism is a little bit more diverse too, as I was talking about the camps and the hunting and this and that. And obviously in Burlington, there's a lot of visitors who might come for business reasons and then stay to do, you know, cultural events. I talk to people like that often. And then UVM draws a ton of parents and families who might come to visit their kids and do things. So it's a little bit more, diverse in some parts of the state than others, and that might be what you're experiencing in Southern Vermont. It's definitely, there are cultural differences.
Fascinating.
Yeah, no, there are definitely, you know, down here, there are days where the majority of the people in any business you go into won't be from here. And, you know, I was talking to colleagues about collecting signatures to get on the ballot, and someone's like, why don't you go to your farmer's market? And I was like, well, I don't think that'll work. Or even, you know, my post office, you know, like most of the people that go past the post office are driving through from outlying towns. So we have both, and what that means is that on any, you know, one of the things that I think is very beautiful about Vermont is that almost all of our communities are really incredibly socioeconomically integrated compared to almost anywhere else in the country. And even individual streets can be incredibly integrated with a mix of, you know, smaller stick homes, manufactured homes, McMansions, hippie geodesic whatevers. You know, it's like almost every road in Vermont has some, dirt road in Vermont has some mix of that. And that's an incredibly dynamic thing. What happens down here on our dirt roads is that half of those homes are often vacant. For various reasons. And that's sort of an interesting thing. What I've seen since the pandemic, though, is it seems like that's happening more and more in certain communities in the kingdom.
You mean second home ownership?
Or the preciousness that has been applied to my corner of Southeast Vermont. I have heard it more and more applied to the Northeast Kingdom, and the kind of businesses that we're able to support down here, which I grew up in New York. Like I grew up eating arugula and Romano and like all of these things. Like I have some fancy tastes, and I appreciate that because of all the tourists coming here, a lot of fancy taste businesses are able to exist, and I can shop there. But what I see happening in the kingdom is similar, you know, like there's some sort of like organic pasta CSA from like, you know, handmade organic pasta CSA. And there's just like all of these precious little businesses that seem super lovely. And I would love to, you know, be part of them. And I imagine that a lot of folks I know who live full time in the kingdom appreciate them being there, but they're not there for the locals, really. Or they're not there for, you know, the longer term locals.
I think the one community in the kingdom that has done a pretty good job of positioning itself to grow with tourism is East Burke. They have the Kingdom Trails bicycle network. So they draw mountain bikers in, and some local business owners have been pretty enterprising about building housing and creating housing. And they involved people in town from the beginning in growing and in shaping this nonprofit that was going to govern the trails. And they've also worked with the Burke Mountain Ski Area, which is also somewhat independently owned. It's owned by J Peak. And so people, I've written about Burke a couple times, and I spend a lot of time there, and I talk to people there, and they don't feel like this is something that is being done to them. Yes, there are a lot of visitors, but they've had some control over saying, what do we want to see happen here? Do we want to have a new road crossing put in the road that between our two country stores? What are we going to do about parking? How much would we like to grow? And so it's been done in a way that it hasn't been suffused with preciousness, really. It might be a function of the people who go up and do gravel bike races. They might be more interested in biking and drinking beer. There is a new microbrewery, the only one in Essex County, than they are in buying like super fancy cheese. I don't know, but so far it seems to be working pretty well for that community. You notice like all of these fancy bikes and people who, with out of state license plates and things like that, but you don't have that same effect that you have in some of the southern Vermont towns and in the ski towns here of crowds of people or of lines or things like that. And they're also being very conscious about growing sustainably and not getting too big for the area, because they know they can't build new roads up there. They can't handle more than a certain amount of traffic.
And I could imagine it's also even different from, say, Craftsbury, which has had this historic summer home scene that creates a big cultural divide between the, summer home people and the non-summer home people.
I have to admit, I love amusement parks. Like, amusement rides, love them. The ship that would go like this and the roller coaster. Oh God, love them so much. But I will admit that there are times I have felt in my state that the state itself is a little bit of a theme park. Rather than a home. And I wish I could be more tangible about that feeling. And I don't know that I can always say why I feel that way. But I'm just bringing that up because I really appreciate this conversation and just hearing how different parts of the state, how tourism is showing up differently in different parts of the state.
Well, I think one piece that results from us sort of, right at the beginning of the show, Anne, you talked about how we sort of sell ourselves to ourselves with the story that we've sort of perpetuated. And, like Vermont's been doing this for 100 years at least. It's
really good at it.
And with whiteness, right? It's been, we've been selling whiteness to white people for a long time, though we are trying to change that now. But I think one thing that results from it is that we wind up, and I see the national media doing this about Vermont and also doing it about other rural places. It's not sort of specific to Vermont. But we wind up sort of selling the story about what a Vermonter is or who a Vermonter is, that then comes home to roost. And so when I was waiting tables here when I was 20, and I remember folks coming in and being really like incredibly rude and dismissive and disrespectful to me. And then finding out that I was here for college and I was actually from where they were from. And all of a sudden, everything changed. And the fact that I was able to sort of code switch and could see their reaction to that told me so much about the stories that they were carrying when they showed up here. And that so many Vermonters are sort of experiencing just that one story, not the one that, happened when they code switched. And I think that a lot of the people can sort of, really make it work in some of the communities that are even more sort of extremely tourist than here in Brattleboro do that code switching in order to sort of maintain their self-respect through the work.
I don't think that's a Vermont phenomenon. I know
No.
because I went to school in New York that my classmates were kind of afraid to go to New Hampshire or even upstate New York. They were just afraid they wouldn't get the right kind of bagel, which they wouldn't. But they were also just afraid of people who looked different from them. And so that's kind of just a cultural thing that, I mean, that's the case in the other countries I've lived in too, you know, sort of the native people versus the visitors, and the native people, the visitors are conscious that they have more money and more opportunities in some ways, and that also makes them feel sort of vulnerable. I don't, you know, one of the reasons that Vermont is such a diverse place in terms of thought, and we see that in our policy and sort of and very progressive in many areas, is because a lot of visitors came up here and loved it and found a way to stay, which is really difficult. And I never apologize for I was born in Australia and raised in Massachusetts, and I wouldn't dream of apologizing for where I come from. And nobody ever expects me to either, you know, I feel like it's great that there are people who've been here for many generations, and it's fine that travelers come up here and try to find a way to make a living, and it's hard to do. And I have a lot of respect for the people who try to do that. I think part of the reason for Burlington's very rapid growth in the tech sector, which is something that a lot of cities and towns of Burlington size have been trying to achieve, and it's happening in Burlington, is because people want to live here, and they're willing to accept some higher costs of living and some higher taxes and regulation in order to keep their company in Vermont and to try and help their employees move to Vermont. So that's kind of one of the nice ways that the Vermont idea and the Vermont mythology is kind of working out for Vermont. I mean, there's so many people like that.
I agree. That is one part of the brand or the tourism and economy that I do appreciate, is how it can attract people. And there was something else you said, Anne, and I'm sorry, I lost my thought. Emily, anything else you want to add? Or if not, I'd love to switch to short-term rentals.
I just want to sort of really agree with you, Anne, except for if you ever run for office, trust me, someone will want you to apologize for not being born here. But I think that's a really powerful part of how Vermont is capable of change and evolving and having new ideas and new humans. And that's how people get here, is visiting once and wanting to stay. And all that we're able to offer to the people who live here because of this sort of false density that's created from tourists coming in. And I appreciate all of those things. I think that there sometimes is a danger of people coming here with sort of the story of Trademark Vermont and then living here and being able to exist in a bubble to a degree that they never actually realize what's happening for their neighbors. And that's true all over the country, that people are living in their own bubbles. But it's an interesting sort of part of when there's a big flood of folks here, like is happening now, or what happened in the 60s with sort of like, the hippies were able to stay in their own hippie bubble for the most part and not really fully integrate. It creates a lot of cultural upheaval, which is for, good and not, and is just what happens. It's an interesting piece of it though. I also think, and this I think will really inform our short-term rental conversation, what's fascinating to me, I think, and is probably much truer in the ski areas or say a Manchester or Woodstock, places that are even more touristy than Brattleboro, is the degree to which folks who are tourists or second, long-term tourists, non-primary homeowners, think that they have a political voice here and manage to get a political voice here. And it's really interesting talking to my colleagues about it. I'm like, they can't vote for you. By definition, they cannot vote for you. You have to be a resident to vote. If they, and it's a really interesting dynamic about sort of how folks who are not full-time residents here are able to get a political handle because of their economic power.
Interesting. Yes, very good point, Emily.
And it comes from people, you know, even when I first ran for office, not even thinking about tourism, people would say things like, because I'm a property owner, I should have a greater voice, or like people just say stuff like that, right? Because I pay more taxes. There's really like a belief inside people's hearts that I think goes fairly unexamined, that the more taxes you pay, the more sort of like voting power you should have, or the more leverage you should have with your legislator.
Yes, I have definitely heard that from second homeowners who are disgruntled about their tax situation and who feel that they should have a bigger voice here.
Yep. So let's bring that back to short-term rentals, because I don't know about both of you, but I have been doing a number of interviews with real estate agents over the past year and a half. And this isn't true across Vermont, because not every community in Vermont has the extra homes to be bought as second homes. But especially in Southern Vermont with our ski area and kind of existing second home traditions, I keep hearing, oh yeah, second home ownership, short-term rental. They're staying here for COVID, and then they're going to turn it into a short-term rental. Like, that is a theme I keep hearing over and over again. How is it showing up for both of you? I'd love to hear from Anne first.
Oh boy, it's been a never-ending story, even before the pandemic. The impact of the short-term rentals on our rental housing market. It's unfortunate. I mean, in a way, it's like Etsy. It's great for people who need to make a living and can turn their apartment or their bedroom into an income source, and it's great. You're making a living on your own, but it is very unfortunate for people who want to rent houses and apartments in Vermont that these are now rented out for much more money to people from out of state who are coming for the weekend. It's, you know, the legislature didn't end up passing a rental registry that would have at least given us an idea of some of what's going on and the impact it's having. But some of the individual towns are now taking it upon themselves to hire companies that regulate these things. So if you have like Killington is doing this, if you have a short-term rental, you have to register it with the town and pay a fee. And eventually, if they wanted to, they could do that with regular rentals too. And that would give them at least a handle on what is going on. In Woodstock, one of the things they're doing is they're going to copy a policy from one of the ski towns out in Montana. I think it's called Big Sky, and they're going to pay people to convert their short-term rentals back to regular rentals. That again is a cumbersome process that not every town can do. And who knows if people will even take them up on it. They haven't even started that policy yet, but they're having a huge impact on the rental market. There's no question. And the Short-Term Rental Association is acknowledging that, and I noticed that they're having a conference in June, and I noticed that Maura Collins from VHFA, the Vermont Housing Finance Association, is actually going to speak at their conference. So the Vermont Short-Term Rental Owners Association has chosen to sort of to own this problem and to say, you know, here's what the problem is, and can we figure out a solution to it that doesn't involve everyone having to lose their short-term rentals.
So I want to say first, look, I prefer staying in short-term rentals to staying in hotels when I'm traveling. Like, I want to name, and I don't think there's anyone who's listening to the show that doesn't know my like basic theory on short-term rentals, but I understand why people like staying in them. For me, it's like more private and cozier for the most part. I really love making my own toast in the morning and not having to talk to a stranger about toast. Like, I love that. I hate talking to a stranger before I've had some caffeine and some toast. So
yep. Or they're great for families too, because hotels will have, right, you know, how many kids can be in a room and all that stuff.
There was a real need and desire in the market that was fulfilled by Airbnb, and I don't want to pretend there isn't. And there are some folks throughout Vermont who, you know, folks who have basically emptied out the family home and can't find another place to move. folks with an apartment and an extra room who really need some extra income. There's a lot of folks who are doing that, you know, I think especially at the beginning of the short-term rental boom, who were using it as a way of sort of just being able to stay in their own homes. At this point, I think there's enough research that that's the minimum of the folks who are doing that. In New York right now, there was just the study that a quarter of rentals have now become short-term rentals.
Wow.
And New York has had a number of proposals for a pied-à-terre tax, which have like no French inside my mouth to pronounce that properly, but which is essentially a separate tax on vacant units, of which a short-term rental would count. Where I get stuck in sort of two different places here. One, it's a hospitality business. Why not just regulate it as a hospitality business for the most part? There's, you know, Vermont has developed like a fairly significant regulatory regime that protects the brand of Vermont by ensuring that people who come here to stay have, you know, health and safety codes and all of those things. And so why not sort of expand that regulatory regime to other hospitality businesses, which is what short-term rentals are. And then the other piece, which was fascinating to me, and I think is a big, interesting part of our second home boom, is when I introduced H200 last session in order to regulate short-term rentals the way hotels are, which I, full disclosure, introduced as a way of sort of, you know, starting a conversation and then being able to just get the short-term rental registry through. It was not like, I didn't really think it was going to pass, but I received hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of emails from short-term rental owners all over the state who received, you know, really intense scare tactic emails from VRBO and Airbnb. And they all wrote to me these very extreme emails, remembering again that none of these folks vote in Vermont for the most part. And what so many of those emails were about was that I took out a second mortgage, or I took out a mortgage for this property dependent on this short-term rental income. That was a business plan that someone had developed and gone into, and that if I personally, because, you know, I am the master of the legislative universe, if I personally banned short-term rentals, they would be sort of belly up on their mortgages, that they would be over leveraged. And that sort of boggled my mind. First of all, like, I absolutely, like, that does not feel like my concern for the most part. My concern is making sure that Vermonters have enough housing to live in. But that there was sort of that transparency that these are businesses and business plans that people are going into, and that that's how this is happening, which is a fine enough thing, but we're not talking about it that way. We're talking about it as if this is something that people are doing to get like a little extra money so they can stay in their homes. And that sort of difference of the two stories, or even that these are sort of existing second homes that families have had for generations and that they're renting out now so that they don't stay vacant. But I was not hearing from those people. I was hearing from people who had taken on debt in order to do this specifically.
It's interesting. It's from what we've seen, those big investors haven't moved in and started buying apartment blocks in Burlington yet, so that it does seem to be mostly individuals who are doing this.
Yes.
But, you know, I think that the regulation that you're talking about, it seems as though that is coming down the road. I mean, it might not be something the state does, but my impression is that if towns like Killington think that it's worth doing it, that other towns can just buy one of these services or maybe all use the same service, I don't know, and start doing that regulation on their own. Because right, I mean, that they're not subject to the same regs or they're certainly not inspected for the same regs that the hotels and other, you know, the traditional accommodations are. It's just that it's a very new industry. It's really interesting to hear about that lobbying from VRBO and Airbnb.
Very much so.
Too, and they're very different with me.
And the Vermont, sort of the Vermont Grassroots Short-Term Rental Alliance, which with a little bit of digging is supported by Airbnb and VRBO and by their lobbyists. In their defense, they didn't just invite Maura Collins, they actually invited me for their last 2 sessions to speak. And so they do seem to want to have conversations about sort of the full spectrum of what the political conversation around this stuff might be.
It's smart.
I was just going to say, I have to jump in and say we have a few more minutes, so I wanted to give the last few minutes to Anne.
I was just going to say that it's smart of them to do that, because in Burlington, this is becoming a life or death issue. I mean, it is all over the state. The housing crisis is real. It's nobody's fault exactly. It's many factors go into it. But in Burlington, there's people who are accepting jobs and that aren't able to take that job because they can't find a place to live. And again, that's happening all over the state too, but it's happening, and it's just kind of like become a human rights issue in Burlington, because the housing crisis there is so stark, and because the short-term rentals play such an obvious role. It's really kind of tragic the way that people who want to live in Vermont, or who want to live near their family, or who got a job here and are trying to live here can't do it. It's not the fault of short-term rentals. It's not the fault of construction prices. It's kind of the whole way our economy has been evolving has just kind of gotten really screwy, and this is one of the consequences of it. But it's definitely a human rights issue, and for sure, short-term rentals are playing a part in that. I'm glad you're going to be at that conference, Emily. I'll talk to you.
Oh, I wasn't invited this year. I was invited all the past years.
Oh.
So I'm planning on maybe crashing it with a couple colleagues.
Okay.
Well, Anne Wallace Allen from 7Days, thank you so much for joining us this week. Remind me, 7Days website.
7daysvt.com, and we just actually put out our tourism issue. It's our summer preview this week, which was yesterday. The paper comes out on Wednesday, so lots of tourism.
Fantastic. So we can find that online as well. Yeah. And Emily, if people want to find more information on you,
folks can go to emilykornheiser.org and get links to all the different ways to get in touch with me, and would love to have a conversation.
And as always, you can find the Montpelier Happy Hour at WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. You can also find it on Brattleboro Community Television. We thank them for their support, and wherever you find your podcasts. You can always also drop us a message at our Facebook page, the Montpelier Happy Hour. So everyone, have a wonderful weekend, and we will see you again next week.